Hello everyone and welcome back to Closets Gaming. Today we are going to take a look at Putrefaction 2 Void Walker. This fast-paced arcade first-person shooter is heavily inspired by old-school shooters and it's currently in early access on Steam and developed by Oleg Kazakov. You can get it off Steam for €5.99 or your regional equivalent. Well, let me start here. As far as I could find, this game has been done by a single person. If that is really the case, this game is seriously incredible. But I am sort of assuming that the main developer probably outsourced some of the game's assets, whether it's some of the graphical design or some of the sound assets. But even so, for a single developer, this is an incredible piece of work and certainly deserves quite a bit of respect. Because, well, the game is actually good, and that is often not the case, especially for a game developed in the former Soviet Union, but luckily, this isn't the case here. But let's first look at a thing that isn't that super great. The graphics of the game. While they certainly aren't bad in any way, they aren't exceptional either. Most of the game's textures are fairly bland and the particle effects aren't impressive in any meaning of the word, and the character animations are really repetitive and not awe-inspiring at all. That doesn't mean that the game looks bad. It just looks like a few years old game. But for its price, there really isn't that much to complain about. What probably bothered me the most were the animations. I wish each enemy type had a couple more of them, but maybe that is something that is on the developer's list. And if the developer has the time, skill, and most of all money to do that, perhaps an improvement to the particle effects, especially to the effects of projectiles coming at you. But overall, the game looks really good at max details. Since we just talked about the graphics, it's only logical to talk about the sounds and music of the game next. At first, I was sort of underwhelmed by it. But over time, as I got further into the game, the soundtrack kept improving all the time. Mostly a metal-based soundtrack really makes the action parts, and there is a lot of them, really engaging. I'm not really that much into metal, so I cannot tell you what kind of metal it is. All I can say it was instrumental only, and it really fits the game. Otherwise, the sound assets of the game are good. Jumping sounds like jumping, shooting like shooting, and explosions like explosions. What more can you really wish for? And the last thing we will talk about before we move on to the actual gameplay is the game's story. At the beginning of the game, you are recruited by a mysterious being. Now, you are the Void Walker, an interplanetary jumping warrior who defends world infested by the Putrid. These horrifying creatures are invading planets and killing everything that lives there. Now you must travel over different planets, gather clues on where the Putrid are actually coming from, and killing incalculable numbers of enemies to find clues, and finally defeat the ultimate enemy. Well, that's it for the things that make up the game's atmosphere. Now on to the actual gameplay. And it's pretty good. Keep in mind this is a $6 game, and yet it plays very, very well. It's not obviously at the same level as last year's Doom, but it's still very fun. For mechanics, there really isn't anything that out of the ordinary. First of all, we have the shooting. I really liked it. Each shot actually has a very decent feel to it, whether it's the most basic pistol or the grenade launcher. The good sound assets do really help this, making each shot feel like it's really impactful. The only issue I have with the shooting itself is sometimes it feels somewhat imprecise. But I do feel like this is a deliberate decision on part of the developer. And since we were already speaking about the gunplay, let's take a look at the weapons you actually have available. You start off with a basic pistol and you quickly find a shotgun. Then later on you also get your hands on some dynamite, a submachine gun, and lastly the already mentioned grenade launcher. As is the standard these days, weapons can also be upgraded. The ways these upgrades can be acquired is through gathering energy that drops off defeated enemies. The upgrades vary from the most basic increase in power of the weapon or an alternate fire mode that can for instance slow or even stun the enemies. But these alternate fire modes also have a decent cooldown, so you can't just stun all of your enemies all the time, making the game trivial. Okay, that's it for the weapons. Now to the exact opposite of the weapons, the game's enemies. In the essentially first two chapters of the game, I have already encountered a pretty decent number of enemy types, from ranged to melee. At the lower difficulties, the melee enemies, especially the stronger ones, posed a much higher threat than the ranged ones, since the damage of the projectiles wasn't really high enough to threaten my character. But when I switched to the highest difficulty, the ranged enemies suddenly were something I had to deal with very quickly. Otherwise, I would get rather quickly overwhelmed, because the amount of space for dodging enemy attacks can get quite limited in close quarters. But the AI isn't really great. Well, to be honest, most of the enemies are really dumb. They don't go for cover or anything like that, but they do at least move around very unpredictably, thus forcing you to be very good at aiming. I do really hope that the AI improves, because at the moment it can be quite often cheesed, especially if you come at an enemy after you did some jumping over the stones and you're coming off a very different direction than the game expects. And since we just mentioned the fact that you can do quite a bit of cheese by going in different directions than the game expects, let's talk for a moment about the level design. The game takes two very different approaches to its levels. First, you will encounter these very open outside levels, which allow for a very large degree of freedom while doing them, and exploring is highly recommended, as each level features at least a few secrets in the best old school game tradition. And while these secrets certainly aren't really important to your progression, as the bonuses they provide aren't really that impressive, they still add on to the game. Secondly, you will encounter highly linear indoors levels, but even these usually branch into at least a few different paths, but you still have to explore them all because they feature part of the objective. But at least you can choose which branch you will take first, at least usually. And the last factor in how the game plays is its difficulty. And the game features 4 levels ranging from easy up to extreme. But the scaling is very different from the usual, and I gotta say I quite like the way it's done here. Instead of the enemies becoming more resistant to fire, to just becoming bullet sponges, the enemies get a boost in damage and the power of drops by them gets reduced, thus forcing you to actually be careful while fighting them. With a good aim and fast reaction times, you can finish even the hardest difficulty and have fun while doing it. But these difficulties relate only to one of the 2 game modes the game offers, the campaign. And there really isn't much to say about it, except that it follows the storyline mentioned earlier. But there is an additional mode for you to play with, the survival mode. Once you get into it, you can further choose between 2 mode options and how you want to play it. Either you can choose to progress through the survival, through levels that get harder over time, and you buy weapons over time as well. The second option gives you all the weapons straight away, but also pits you against the strongest enemies immediately, and you must survive as long as you can. It's nice that this mode is here, since it highly prolongs the potential time you can spend with this game. Before we conclude this review, we should also talk about the game's performance a bit, and it's really divided. In terms on how well it runs, in FPS, there it runs pretty well, but that's really not that surprising since it runs on Unity, and that isn't that much of a demanding engine. But there are a lot of technical glitches in the game at the moment. Textures sometimes do wanky things, sometimes they disappear altogether, but the game is pretty stable at least. I encountered only a single crash throughout my gameplay time, but I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the game's fault, since I was doing some overclocking testing at the same time. So, in conclusion, the game is really good, fun and fast, all the things you actually want from a first-person shooter. And if this project is really being done by a single person and I couldn't find any evidence that would go against this, and feel free to correct me on this game is super impressive. If you don't mind early access game, this is really something you should consider picking up, especially for the low price of $6. Well, that's it for today guys. Hope you liked the video, and if you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing. And if you didn't, well, dislike it. See you all next time with more gaming content.